Right, so we're going to do something slightly different from what you've seen thus far today. Because as Francis said, I am an archaeologist, so I'm going to talk to you about archaeology. Namely skyscape archaeology, which is what we now call archaeoastronomy. It's been recently defined as a branch of archaeology that draws on historical, ethnographic, astronomical, meteorological and climatic evidence to reconstruct how the skyscape was experienced and understood by ancient peoples. This is a Sophia Center invention. It was created by basically myself and Liz Henty, as Nick mentioned before. And it was created as a way to reflect on how archaeoastronomy has been done in the past. Now, if you haven't heard about archaeoastronomy, it's basically the study of how ancient monuments like Stonehenge here relate to the sky, mostly by looking at alignments. Alignment of the architecture with the rising or setting of the sun or the moon, which is what you see there, that's the full moon, not the sun, or the stars, and how that might tell us something about the people who built these things and why they were built in the first place. Now, this has a long pedigree in the history of scholarship, but it never really flourished into a fully fledged academic discipline. There are reasons for that, but I'm not going to get into that. But part of the mission for skyscape archaeology is to reflect on the issues that exist within archaeoastronomy. And one of those issues is exactly on how can we build an argument for a celestial alignment when we find one. Because obviously you can throw two rocks in the air and they will form a line when they hit the ground, and that line will for sure align with one star at least, if not the sun or the moon or the planets, right? So it's not just about finding alignments, it's about building an argument for them having been intentionally built into the structure. And historically, traditionally in the discipline, when we are faced with building an argument, we basically have a choice. And just like Morpheus gave Neo a choice between a red pill and a blue pill, if you're too young, that was the movie The Matrix from 1999. Archaeoastronomers have a choice between a brown pill and a green pill. And that's what we call brown archaeoastronomy or green archaeoastronomy. And the colors are based on the covers of these books. There's two books. I'll show you the other one in the next slide. Proceedings of a conference that happened in the mid-1980s, and they split the proceedings into a book that focused on archaeoastronomy in the New World, and that had a brown cover, and archaeoastronomy in the Old World, and that had a green cover. Soon people realized that actually there were patterns here, because the contributions in this book were all using the same methodology, and the contributions in the green book were using a different methodology. And those methodologies gained the name brown and green archaeoastronomy. So this one is commonly used in the New World, so in the Americas, and that's because it uses the historical and the ethnographic record. It studies societies that either left behind some writings, like for example the Mesoamerican pyramids. We have writings from the Mayans and the Aztecs. We also have the chronicles of the Spanish conquerors that wrote a lot about their rituals and their belief systems. And therefore, when you study one of the Mayan pyramids, like, I completely forgot what this is. I know it's a temple of Kukulkan, but I can't remember the name of the site. Chichen Itza, thank you. When you study a monument like this, and you find an alignment, for example, to Venus, you can say, or you can build an argument for the alignment to be intentional based on the Dresden Codex, for example. We know the Mayans were avid astronomers and astrologers, but they were observing the movements of Venus for decades. So that makes it easier for you to accept that when I tell you that this might be aligned to Venus. This one isn't actually, but it's just an example. It also means you can study sites that are unique. A pyramid that is unique, or a building that is unique. You don't have many of them, because you can rely on either historical texts or ethnographic evidence. If you're studying South American tribes or North American tribes, you actually have either you have the descendants of those communities available to you, or you have the anthropological literature to rely on. In the Old World, which really means Europe, archaeoastronomy focused in prehistory. So by definition, there's no writings. And also, there's no ethnographic record, because between the people who built Stonehenge 4,500 years ago and us right now, there's been lots of demographic breaks. So, what's the solution? The solution is to use statistics, or I need to use the mouse. Or what I actually refer to as statistical thinking, because often statistics isn't used, but the reasoning behind statistics is used. And the reasoning here is that we cannot study a single site. We need to study many sites that are similar. So instead of studying one stone circle, we need to study all the stone circles of a particular region to try to find a pattern. And if there is a pattern in their orientation or their alignments, then we can suggest that that pattern must be intentional, must have been put there intentionally by design. So these are two very different approaches to archaeoastronomy, the brown or the green approach, right? And in the last 10 to 15 years, it became quite common in the literature, and I have also I have published myself saying that actually this divide no longer exists in the field. And I'm about to contradict myself in the next 40 minutes or so. Because although the divide itself doesn't exist, you now have scholars from both sides of the Atlantic working together, for example, applying statistics to study the orientation of Mayan structures. So therefore blurring the lines between the green and the brown. That's what you see here. But the argument I'm putting to you today is that even though this is true, the line has been blurred, archaeoastronomy is still seeing the world in only two colors, brown or green. And yet the world is, of course, there's a lot more colors than that. And I'm going to make the case using perhaps the world's most famous example of an alignment, Stonehenge, a site that over the last year I've become incredibly familiar with, whether I wanted to or not. In case you don't know, Stonehenge is basically the stone circle that I'm sure you know, but it's actually comprised of two stone circles with two different types of stone. The big sarsens are relatively local. The smaller blue stones are the ones that came from South Wales. And then there's a horseshoe inside. Well, there have been two horseshoes. And this is actually, can't remember what the next slide is. Oh, there you go. That's the front view of the facade. So you would have a complete circle of these big sarsen stones all the way around. And then inside it's this horseshoe of 5 trilithons. There's one missing here, and there's another one that collapsed there. Sorry, when I say missing, it's actually there on the ground. But this circle is actually embedded in a much larger structure. You can see here there are these banks go all the way around, and there's a ditch just on the outside of that bank. There's another stone here, the slaughter stone. And here's the traditional archaeological plan for Stonehenge. So that's the circle and the horseshoe, that's the bank and the ditch. There's other things here, and a couple of standing stones here, and something else that keeps going that way that I'll come back to it in a bit. But that just places you. But the main thing about Stonehenge in terms of alignments is that there is this axis that cuts the monument into two equal parts. So it cuts across through the both circles, the external earthwork circle and the stone circle, and it follows the direction of this avenue, which goes on for a little bit. And that line matches the orientation of the rising sun at midsummer and the setting sun at midwinter. And that's why every year you have about 10,000 people at Stonehenge celebrating midsummer sunrise. There were 15,000 people this year. It was a really good night. It was also a football night. Whereas for December solstice, you don't usually get that many people. It's only about 100, I would say, because it's miserable in Salisbury Plain at midwinter. And here's a reconstruction of what the midwinter sunset would look like. This is on the English Heritage website. Because we have reason to believe, and I'll come back to this point later in the talk, that it was the midwinter that was the important one, or the most significant one, let me put it that way, rather than the midsummer. So it's kind of reversed of what happens today. Right, so that's the received knowledge, right? I don't want to give you a talk on the history of where that comes from, but where are we in terms of the scholarship behind Stonehenge and its alignments today? And 2 months ago in May, the book on Stonehenge and its alignments came out, and it's this book by Clive Ruggles, undoubtedly the modern father of archaeoastronomy, and Amanda Chadbourne, who collaborated with Clive. Amanda is an archaeologist. She worked for many years for Historical England, where she was responsible for the, amongst other things, the narratives around Stonehenge. So it's an instant classic. It's a beautifully illustrated book, and I wholeheartedly recommend it. It came out with Liverpool University Press. And so I think it's a good place it's a good example to look at in detail, to try to see whether this brown-green issue, whether we moved away from it or not. Obviously, I don't have time to go into the book in detail, but I do recommend you get it. This is the table of contents, and I'm going to just use the table of contents to illustrate what I perceive to be perhaps the only issue with this book, because I still recommend it. So after the first few chapters, which cover the basics of astronomy, archaeoastronomy, question of orientation, and then the description of the archaeology of Stonehenge itself, you get chapters 5, 6, and 7, which detail the alignments themselves, not only the ones I've shown you, there are other alignments at Stonehenge. But what you have here is chapter 5 focuses on Stonehenge, then 6 in other sites around Stonehenge, and 7 goes even wider into the entire World Heritage landscape. So what we have here is a version of green archaeoastronomy. They're trying to argue for the alignments at Stonehenge having been intentional because there are more alignments of the same kind in monuments around Stonehenge. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying that's what they're doing. Then you have chapter 8, which focuses on what you can see today, and there are problems with that because there's, for example, a forest plantation blocking the view. And that's more for heritage management purposes. But then chapters 10 and 11, the skies, religion and ritual, Stonehenge and beyond, and the meaningful sun, which try to provide the interpretation. Why were they building these solstitial alignments at Stonehenge? What they're doing is brown archaeoastronomy. Because they're not talking about the people who built Stonehenge at all. They use historical and ethnographic analogies. So they cast their net much, much wider, and they're bringing in all this historical and ethnographic evidence for why the sun has been important for all these different cultures across time, and bringing that into Stonehenge. So it's a very brown approach. So I think the book does illustrate the fact that archaeoastronomy is still seeing the world in just these two colors. But as part of our Skyscape archaeology mission, it's really about, like I said, reflecting. And I mean going deep into our biases, the biases that we bring to the research, the assumptions that we make, sometimes unconsciously, especially the ones that we make unconsciously. Now, I had like 4 or 5 slides detailing, going through brown and green archaeoastronomy in detail, and then I realized I had to cut them out because I don't have time. What I do have is a summary, okay, I've said this, of both. And the main problem that I see is that both green and brown archaeoastronomy assume that alignments can only be argued for with recourse to either more alignments, statistics, so the green side, or direct historical or ethnographic evidence. You need to have the intention behind places like Stonehenge consciously and explicitly written down or passed down through the generations. But the truth is that we don't work that way. Even looking at more recent historical events in contemporary times where there's so much evidence and written evidence, right? Figuring out the intention behind particular historical events or particular people is incredibly difficult, let alone when you go back 5,000 years and you're trying to make sense of the people who built Stonehenge. But what I'm trying to say is that they're looking for astronomy, or they're looking for explanations in either more astronomy or text. It's as if heaven and earth don't relate at all. You can only argue for alignments by looking for more alignments or for an explicit explanation. They're not considering the other ways that the skyscapes can relate to society. So I think what we need to do is actually start from scratch and ask the question of how does the sky find itself embedded in society? And then construct a methodology that relies on the answer to this question. Are you with me? Mm-hmm. Some of you are. Good. So I'm going to briefly make a case for a different way of doing this. Let me look at what time I have. Oh, that's all right. So if you were here 2 years ago, I gave a talk on time, what time is, and the understanding of how societies conceptualize time from a historical and ethnographic perspective, how the two are actually coming together, and the implications that has for archaeology. I spoke at length on ecological time, so I'm not going to do that now, but I'm going to give you a couple of slides on that, because it is an example of how the celestial objects find themselves embedded in so many different aspects of society. So ecological time is the concept of time that most non-Western, non-modern societies have. This is the time that is cyclical instead of linear. And I'm not going to focus on the cyclicality of it, but what this table illustrates, and this is one example out of many ethnographic examples I could have pulled, they're all very similar. This is from the Bororo tribes of the Amazon. And you can see the months of the year, and you can see what the sun is doing, what the Pleiades are doing. That's the most important constellation in the sky for them. Sorry, I should have said asterism, not constellation. And how they relate to the important things in their social world and environmental world. The climate change, the change between the dry season and the wet season. Their forms of residence, so here they're nomadic for about 3 months in the year, and then they're sedentary the rest of the time. What they're doing in terms of agriculture, in terms of fishing, and what they're doing in terms of ritual. All these things blend together. This is a sort of calendar for them. But the key thing about ecological time is that none of these things are dictated by what the sun is doing or the Pleiades are doing. Everything is interrelated. So Stephen Fabian, who spent quite a few months with the Bororo of Brazil, came up with this idea of layering. This is how they tell time, through layering. Basically, this is the example from his book. These 5 layers here, plant, month, time of day, season, and star, correspond to a point in time in the cycle of a specific plant that they can see by looking at it, being observed in a particular month, meaning the moon, particular moon, at a certain time of day during one of the seasons, and during the annual cycle of a star or constellation. So these are all observations they are making. They're trying to see where in the individual cycles of these things they are. Of course, any single observation among the 5 could produce useful information. You could base your entire calendar system on what the sun is doing or what the Pleiades are doing, like we tend to think about it. However, combining the information derived from all 5 observations would yield the most significant indication of a particular activity, and this is how they do it. They never look at just one thing, they look at many, and then they try to figure out. And there are examples of crises that this creates when sometimes they think they're in month 7, and then the rains start, and the rains are not supposed to start until month 8, and therefore that creates a sort of crisis. They need to kind of negotiate, why are the rains starting earlier? And they might reach the conclusion that actually they have been in month 8 all along. That sort of paradox tends to happen. But that's not what I'm trying to focus on here. I'm trying to focus on this. This is how they see the world. All these things are interconnected. There isn't just one thing that tells you time. There isn't a calendar that you go and look up time. It's the interrelatedness between these things, which include the sky, the celestial objects, as well as the natural world and the cultural world. Of course, that's our division, isn't it? Another example that I am quite fond of, because originally I was going to do my MA dissertation on Claude Lévi-Strauss, and then I didn't. Then I did it on prehistoric sites, and here I am now. But so every once in a while I like to come back to Lévi-Strauss. Claude Lévi-Strauss is unfortunately no longer a household name in anthropology, but he was the founder of structural anthropology, which is a key movement in the history of the field. He was particularly influential in the 60s and a little bit in the 70s. And into the 80s, I should say. He wrote a lot, but his magnum opus, his major works, were the Mythologique in the original French, which has been translated to English as Introduction to a Science of Mythology. There's 4 massive volumes, numbered volumes, plus 3 others that are sort of continuations of the same work. In the 4 main volumes, he analyzed over 1,000 American myths. He starts in South America and he slowly goes all the way up to Alaska. And he's looking at these myths and trying to untangle the structure that he sees, the way this is the way he interpreted structure, is more like the way the human brain works. And in all of those myths, there's a lot of astronomy. Surprise, surprise. But particularly in volume 1 and 3, he spends entire sections of those books just discussing the astronomy behind those myths. And he finds those myths are all interrelated. I should have said that. This is how he opens a section that he called Well-Tempered Astronomy in the first volume. In granting that myths have an astronomical significance, I do not propose to revert in any way to the mistaken ideas characteristic of the solar mythography of the 19th century. In my view, the astronomical context does not provide any absolute point of reference. We cannot claim to have interpreted the myths solely or simply by relating them to this context. The truth of the myth does not lie in any special content. It consists in logical relations, which are devoid of content, etc., etc., etc. We start to lose him here. And the truth is that not many people in the world can claim to have read his entire work or even understood it. It gets quite murky and complicated. But the key points I'm trying to highlight in the way he approaches myth, and in not just the way he approaches myth, but what he sees coming out of these vast amounts of ethnographic data, is that there is an astronomical code behind the myths, but there's also geographical, anatomical, sociological, ethical, and they all fit together. They all relate. These are pictures from one of his books. You can see in that one on the bottom left, there's astronomical and cosmic at the top, but there's human, natural, biological, sexual, elementary, technological, cultural, social, keeps going. Outside the social group, war, marriage, etc. All these things are related, and you can see that in the myths. So he creates this sort of net, it's a sort of network, isn't it, of all these things together. So how can we make sense of both this and the layering using modern anthropological theory? And what I'm proposing is that the idea of a relational ontology, which has become quite common in the humanities, is very useful here, because I think that's both what Fabian and Lévi-Strauss were trying to get at, even though they didn't have those concepts. So the relational ontology has been suggested as an alternative to what is seen as the modern Western ontology, that is based on substance instead of relation. So when we look at these things, we know that a hammer is a hammer because it has a particular shape and it's made of a particular hardy substance, right? That's what makes a hammer. A shoe is something completely different, right? It has a particular shape, it has a particular size, it is made of particular materials, and the rock again, the same thing, right? You get the idea. These are different things for us, the way we see the world, the way we conceptualize the world. In a relational ontology, it's not about the substance, it's about the relations that they make. So all of these things can be a hammer, because you can use all of them to hammer a nail. This is difficult to understand, and I'm not asking you to do that in 3 slides. It takes a while. But think of the difference between a noun and a verb, because ultimately that's what we're talking about. Anything that you can use to hammer is a hammer in a relational ontology. And this also means that things are much more fluid. You know, a shoe can be a shoe in one circumstance and a hammer in a different circumstance. So for traditional societies that tend to have relational ontologies, it's not about being, it's about becoming. It's about changing. Things change their nature all the time. But also in relation to all of these relationships that they make with each other and with people and with the cosmos. So what we're talking about is, yes, that we have these things in our way of seeing the world and they all relate together, but for people who have a relational ontology, it's not about these things, it's about the relations. So it's like the negative of that. Doing well for time. Okay, I'll let you digest that while I drink this. So, relational ontologies have been relatively well established with anthropology and archaeology. Archaeologists, in the last 10 years or so, have really been pulling from these ideas from anthropology to try to make sense of the archaeological record. However, I do want to point out that they've been doing this in one of 2 ways. Either by taking a reconstructed relational ontology from, say, a South American tribe, that has been the ontology has been reconstructed by the anthropologist, so it wasn't a direct thing. We weren't told that they see the world in this way. The anthropologist has reconstructed that from analysis of different tribes. I'm talking of Eduardo Viveiros de Castro and his perspectivism, if you know about that. It's quite popular in archaeology. The other way was by taking a modern relational ontology based on, for example, quantum physics. And there's quite a few of those around. And I'm not saying they're not interesting, because they force you to think in different ways and approach the material you're studying in different ways. But if we really want to understand how relational ontology works, why are we not looking at the only other philosophy in the world that has as long, if not a longer pedigree than the one that led to our substantive ontology? And I'm not talking about the Greeks, I'm talking about the Chinese. The Chinese philosophy is entirely relational. It never stopped being relational. And they have been writing philosophical tracts for at least 2,500 years. So why not look at that for inspiration, instead of looking at reconstructed Amazonian ontologies or things based on quantum physics that may not necessarily have fully grasped the nuances of a relational ontology. So obviously, again, I could give you an entire few hours of this, but you can literally pick any book in this library and you will find a table similar to this. If you haven't noticed, this is the Kavanaugh China Library, right? Because every book you pick up on China will talk about their correlative cosmology. These correlations between things. So we have the so-called 5 elements. They're not really elements. They're more like agents or movements, would be the literal translation. And so water, wood, fire, soil or earth and metal. And then, of course, each one has a planet, Mercury, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, Venus, an organ system in the body, the basis of traditional Chinese medicine, a color, a season, and a direction, etc. These tables can go on forever. Basically, it's a way of splitting the world into 5 different ways. But this is a relational ontology. That's what we're seeing. It just hasn't been written by the sinologists as an ontology because they didn't have, as a relational ontology, because they didn't have that concept. What we're seeing is a relation between these things. Water, mercury, kidney, the color blue, winter, north, for example. Actually, the example I'm going to give you in the next slide is not that, is wood. So all of these things are related. You have the liver channel, you have the actual liver, the tendons and sinews, the eyes, there's other things in the body, the planet Jupiter, the direction of east, the spring, a very tall tree, or the Hun, the young soul in Chinese cosmology, which is the soul that gets reincarnated over generations. All of these things are related, but they're not related through symbolic connection. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about relational ontology. We're not saying that the east symbolizes wood, or that the liver symbolizes wood, or vice versa. We're saying that they are all the same thing. They are wood. Or if you want to think about it in a perhaps more amenable way for our own Western mindset, they are manifestations of wood at different layers of reality. So, in the organs of the body, wood manifests as the liver and the gallbladder. But in the tissues, it manifests as the tendons and the sinews. In the energetic body, if you want, it manifests as the liver channel and the gallbladder channel, of course. At the soul level of reality, it manifests as the Hun. In the sky, it manifests as Jupiter, the wood star, is literally what the Chinese characters for Jupiter means, wood star. There's other names as well, but that's the first name, etc. Do you get the gist of what I'm saying? They are all the same thing, just manifesting at different layers of reality. So yes, this is all relational. I think you get that. Probably didn't need that slide. So, how can we weaponize this for archaeology? We should be doing what... Can't believe I'm going to say this, but I am going to say it. Because you're a good crowd. We should be doing what Chinese doctors do. We should be looking for patterns across multiple layers. Let me go back a slide. A Chinese doctor, to diagnose you, is not going to, if you have a liver problem, he's not just going to be looking at your liver. He's going to be looking at all of these things. Because they're all related. They're all the same. So the liver issue might manifest itself in your eyes, or in your muscles, or the tendons, or your relationship to the direction of east. We're stepping into feng shui now, obviously. Right? All of these things are interrelated. So you're looking for patterns not at the same layer of reality. You're looking for patterns that cut across all these different layers. And that's how we weaponize this. We need to look for patterns not by looking only at alignments, but looking across the whole of that society and everything they left behind us. Multiple layers of reality. So we shouldn't look for patterns only by looking at orientations or the textual and oral records. There's a whole breadth and depth of archaeology out there. Why are we not looking at that? Particularly when we're looking at prehistory, of course, which is my speciality. And when you do that, it gives you a completely different outlook. It's not just a different way of arguing for a celestial alignment. It actually forces you to think about the alignment in a different way. So, okay, Fabio, this is incredibly theoretical. Yes, I apologize. I do like theory. But let's try to apply this to Stonehenge. Cool. Excellent. So, here we are, zoomed in version, bird's eye view. This is obviously what it looks like today, not what it looked like 2500 BC. So let's look at the different layers of reality here. Let's look at the architecture. What we have in terms of the big stones, the sarsen stones, we have, looks like a smiley face, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We have a circle and we have this sort of horseshoe. Because the horseshoe is open at one end, we know that, there's no stone holes here, there would have been no stones there. It's already giving you a direction, which happens to coincide with the axis of symmetry. So if you can cut a line through Stonehenge that will divide it into two equal parts, That's the line that matches the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. So that's another layer. Okay, this is the layer that usually archaeoastronomy looks at. Here's another layer that archaeoastronomy usually looks like, an image that I absolutely stole from Clive and Amanda's book. These are the many sites within the World Heritage Stonehenge landscape, which is the area in yellow. Each one of those red things is an archaeological site, roughly contemporary with Stonehenge. And the green arrows that I've added represent the solar alignment within this landscape. So there are other monuments contemporary with Stonehenge, like Woodhenge, which is a sort of wooden counterpart to Woodhenge, which has the same alignment as Stonehenge. Then we have Durrington Walls, which was the settlement where we now know the people who were using Stonehenge were staying at. That has the complementary alignment. So instead of midwinter sunset, it's midwinter sunrise. Instead of midsummer sunrise, it's midsummer sunset. And then we have Larkhill Enclosure, which is a large enclosure. We don't really know what it was used for. That has a few post holes that are marking the same alignment as Stonehenge. So again, this is the green archaeoastronomy layer. We're looking at other sites, roughly contemporary, probably built by the same people or descendants of the same people with the same alignments. That adds to the argument. But my argument is we shouldn't stop there. Stonehenge, like most things, was not built in a day. It was built over a large period of time. The monument we see today is not how it was originally designed. We now divide it into several stages, its history or its prehistory. Stage 1, around 3000 BC, would have looked like this. It's basically a bank and a ditch with 56 pits around it that may or may not have held bluestones. That's still highly debated. But I want to draw your attention to the gap here, which is where the modern entrance to Stonehenge is. Modern, I don't mean modern present, I meant the later entrance to Stonehenge is. And if I overlay the later solstitial alignment, you will see something interesting. That's off the alignment. The alignment actually goes through this ditch here. And in fact, there's been suggestions that in this earlier phase, the interest was not on the sun, but on the moon further down here. Can talk about that later if you want. I'll finish in 5 minutes, Francis. If you want, come and talk to me. I'll tell you about that. But I'm focusing on this alignment. That's what we're trying to explain. Now, notice what happens around that area. In the second stage, around 500 years later, completely redesigned the interior of the monument. That's when the circle, the stone circle, and the horseshoe comes in. They open this up. And that's when the alignment first appears, the alignment in the architecture. So they clearly had to clear that up in order to make sure that there was a visible line of sight. This is adding to the argument that this was intentional. It's not by accident, right? You're with me? Mm-hmm. Excellent. Later on, about 300 years later, they put an avenue. They basically cut an avenue into the chalk, because that's the bedrock there, leading straight into this entrance. And that avenue goes all the way to the River Avon, which then connects, if you go up the river, connects to Durrington Walls, which also has a tiny avenue connecting its entrance. So that's a processional route connecting those two places. And we actually believe people from Durrington Walls would have gone into the River Avon, come down, get out in West Amesbury, where the avenue is, and come up the avenue to get to Stonehenge. So it's a processional route. They would have come up this way. Again, emphasizing this alignment is intentional, because they could have, if it wasn't, they could have placed the avenue anywhere. But also emphasizes the December solstice, sunset. Because if you're coming up the avenue, you're not going to be looking back at what the sun is doing. You can look at what the sun is doing in the winter, not in the summer. Here's another layer that I've never seen used in an argument for archaeoastronomy at Stonehenge. Okay, I actually need to speed up now. In around 2011, there was a detailed laser scan done of Stonehenge. And they analyzed the laser scan, and they allowed them to, amongst many other things, like for example finding new rock art, they discovered that not all stones had been worked on in terms of polishing them a little bit. Because when you're there and you look at some of the stones, some of them are very rough, but then others, they're not really polished, because obviously we're talking about the Stone Age. They were hammering rocks on them to try to work on them. But they're a little bit smoother. And when they plotted out the ones that were smoother, they noticed some patterns. So on the outside, looking from the outside into Stonehenge, the only stones that were polished were the ones there on that orange, purple band. That's the facade of Stonehenge. None of the other stones were polished on the outside. And they suggested that Stonehenge was meant to be seen only from somewhere up here. And that's why they only polished these ones. They only worked on those ones. Because no one was supposed to approach Stonehenge from any other direction, so they would never have to see the other stones. On the inside, a similar pattern occurs. There's a lot more of them worked on the inside. But if you look over here, that's a standing stone that is not worked on the inside. That's another one that isn't. Only the stones that you can see when you're in the center were worked on. The ones that are behind other stones weren't. So they were being lazy, perhaps, or economy of resources comes to mind. I'm not going to spend hundreds of hours hammering these stones if nobody has to see them. So this suggests that Stonehenge was meant to be looked at. The stones were meant to be looked at from two places. Somewhere up here in the northeast, which is exactly where you need to be in order to see the December solstice sunset, or in the center, which is exactly where you need to be in order to see the June solstice sunrise alignment. So we're moving beyond the geometry of the alignment. We're starting to think about where people need to be and how they experience these things. It's a different way of looking at alignments. Final piece of evidence from Durrington Walls that I said is the settlement. Hundreds and hundreds of pig bones were found there. They were having these massive feasts for a very long period of time. They found a lot of pig mandibles with teeth, and when you have the mandible with teeth, you can actually analyze the teeth for tooth wear, which tells you how old the pig was when it was killed. And this graph shows you the age of the pig in months and the number of mandibles that were found. And because pigs at the time, this particular type of pig, farrows in the spring, these peaks correspond to the first winter. So these were pigs that were killed in their first winter, pigs that were killed in their second winter, pigs that were killed in their third winter. So even though there's a continuum, there may have been people there all year round, there was a lot more people at winter time, which relates or correlates with the midwinter alignment. There were more people there for the midwinter alignment than for the midsummer alignment, which would be these troughs here. So again, the reverse of what happens today. But it adds to the argument that this alignment was intentional. People were actually there in the winter. So these are all the pieces of evidence I brought. You can think of this as layering. These are different layers. And to build an argument, to try to understand what the hell was happening there, you need to look at all the layers. You can't just look at one, which is the alignment, or two, which is the alignment at Stonehenge and other sites. You need to look at all of them. Or you can think of it as a relational web, like I've shown you a few. It's exactly the same thing. All of these things are related. Now you'll notice I didn't touch on the $1 million question, right? Which is the meaning of Stonehenge, or the function, or even the affect. How does the alignment affect people? What sort of emotions did it inspire in people? These are the big unknowns. But these things would be other aspects of this relational web. So by mapping out as much as we can, my hope is that we will get closer to these ones than we've had before. So just to wrap up, that's the concluding slide. I hope I've demonstrated in the brief amount of time that I had that we actually haven't moved past the green and brown divide, because we're still seeing the world in a green and brown way. And when I say I mean archaeoastronomers. So one way of going outside of that is to consider relational ontologies that force you into looking at every aspect of society. And I've offered one way of doing that, which focuses or takes inspiration from the Chinese philosophy, Chinese relational ontology, and forces you to look at these multiple layers of reality, multiple layers of the evidence, try to see how they fit, how these pieces fit together, and what the narrative that comes out of it is. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I think I'm within time.